Hello everybody and welcome back to Know Your Ship with me, Chase. In this episode, I cover the very famous Yorktown class of carriers, which included the USS Yorktown, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Hornet. Now, due to their extensive operational histories, I will be making multiple episodes, so stay tuned. In this episode, I cover their early operations, so sit back, relax, and hear the story of the Yorktown class carriers.
The first carrier, Yorktown, was a stepchild of two things: the Great Depression and fascism. President Franklin D. Roosevelt confronted both threats with one stroke.
As part of the National Industrial Recovery Act, $238 million was set aside to build naval ships. The $38 million was for these two aircraft carriers, the Yorktown and for the Enterprise, and the building process began at Newport News. Being the class leader, Yorktown was built first. President Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was chosen to christen the ship.
Yorktown launches on April 4th, 1936. Designated as CV-5, the fifth of a young United States carrier force, she is designed to incorporate all the experience and lessons learned from operations of the first four carriers. At 19,800 tons, Yorktown is barely two-thirds the displacement of the upcoming Essex class. Her 827-foot 6-inch length accommodates some 80 planes divided among fighters and torpedo and dive bomber squadrons. Yorktown's 32.5 knot speed allows her to outrace submarines and spearhead fast-moving sea battles. Her peacetime complement of 2,217 men will rise to nearly 3,000 in war. Through the late 30s, Yorktown is part of fleet war games. She's working out new tactics for aircraft carriers that up to now have been seen mostly as subordinate to the needs of the battleship line.
In this period, there was a photo op, and it had the Enterprise, the Yorktown, the Ranger, and the Lexington in line. All they were doing was coming back to base after a fleet exercise. But that picture is what influenced some of the Japanese naval aviators to think about combining carriers as an independent strike force rather than to have it, as was still the practice with both the British and with the United States Navy, of having the carriers basically there to defend the battle line or the battleships.
The 7th Enterprise was a Yorktown-class aircraft carrier. Her site numbers were CV-6.
Enterprise, the word itself means bold initiative with risk. And there's probably no better definition that could describe the life of the aircraft carrier Enterprise CV-6. In 1934, the keels were laid for both the Yorktown and for the Enterprise, and the building process began at Newport News.
This Enterprise is 809 feet long, with a flight deck beam of 114 feet. She carries 88 aircraft, ranging from fighters to dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Pre-war, she is armed with 8 5-inch guns distributed along her gallery deck. Her secondary anti-aircraft batteries are numerous but undersized, fast-firing 1.1-inch guns in quad mounts and a scattering of 50 caliber machine guns. She is highly maneuverable, and her propulsion system can drive her at a brisk 32 knots. To get at least one new carrier begun immediately, President Franklin D. Roosevelt authorizes Hornet as one last ship of the old Yorktown-class. As the 8th aircraft carrier of the United States Navy, Hull 385 is designated CV-8. She launches on December 14, 1940.
It was built in Newport News, Virginia, and it was sponsored by Mrs. Knox. Mr. Knox was the Secretary of the Navy at the time. It was the most beautiful ship you ever saw. When we walked down that pier to go on board and you look, it's like, my God, it's a monster. Flight deck was 800 some odd feet.
The new $32 million ship has barely 2.5 years to live. Her first skipper is Captain Mark Mitcher.
He was the ultimate and the commanding officer of a ship. He not only had the safety of the ship in mind, but the safety of everybody aboard. He trusted everybody in their knowledge and their ability to do their job.
Hornet is somewhat advanced over her Yorktown derivative. She is 827 feet long and 114 feet wide at the flight deck. She displaces 25,500 tons under full load. Speed is her best feature. Her 4-geared turbine engines spin 4 propellers for a top speed of 33 knots, fast enough to keep up with any known task force ship, including destroyers. But the flaws that will help doom Hornet are in place. Her topside armor is not on her flight deck, but concentrated on the floor of the hangar deck below to protect fuel, ammunition, and machinery spaces. Bombs of any size can penetrate to the vulnerable pack of planes one deck down. Even more unfortunate is the design that has put her 2 boiler rooms together, just forward of 2 adjoining engine rooms. A bomb or torpedo piercing either engine or fire room can cripple propulsion at one stroke. The 81 warplanes that Hornet carries, a mix of Wildcat fighters, Devastator torpedo bombers, and Dauntless dive bombers, leave much to be desired. Like Hornet's design, they belong to a much earlier age.
The aircraft that it got were not the best. They weren't the bottom of the barrel, but they were not the best and the most modern.
USS Enterprise finally steams into its home port on the evening of December 8th, roughly 32 hours after the attack.
The ships were on fire. There was smoke everywhere. There was oil all over the water. I don't recall seeing any bodies floating around, thank goodness, but it was a nasty mess. It looked bad, it smelled bad. You could almost feel gloom and doom in the air.
They had fireboats and tugs in trying to put out the fires. The surface of Pearl Harbor was about maybe 3-4 inches deep with fuel oil.
Surveying the destruction, Admiral Halsey swears that when he's done, the Japanese language will only be spoken in hell. Halsey orders every able body on the ship, officer and enlisted alike, to help refuel and reprovision Enterprise as quickly as possible. It's a job that normally takes a full day of round-the-clock work. On this day, the men get it done in 7 hours.
for the USS Enterprise to roll into Pearl Harbor, see all that carnage, for them to do what they need to do, within 7 hours, turn right back around and get back out to sea. Most people would think that would be pretty amazing. I just think that it just shows the American spirit. That, you know what, okay, you did this to us, watch this. Here we come now.
The sneak attack on Pearl has crippled the American Pacific Fleet. 4 cruisers, 5 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary ships have been damaged or destroyed. None of the fleet's 8 battleships have been spared. 4 are sunk, and the rest have taken heavy damage. But by striking when none of the 7 U.S. aircraft carriers were in port, the Japanese made a critical mistake. And they know it. Starting now, Enterprise and her fellow carriers are at the top of the enemy hit list.
Of course, the Japanese wanted them carriers. Because, first of all, they're taking out one of our ships, then they're taking out airplanes, and they're taking out personnel all at the same time. So they're like killing 3 birds with 1 stone. They believe if they could have knocked out all of our carriers, that they could win this war hands down.
We knew that we were an awful big target.
Enterprise sails out of Pearl on Tuesday morning into a strange new world, where the threat of death looms just over the horizon.
I suspect every one of us probably would have had in our mind, well, why did this have to happen? But now that it has, what are we going to do about it?
When we went back to sea on Tuesday morning, for all we knew, we were right into the jaws of the Imperial battle fleet. So we were a bunch of scared sailors.
Understandably, tensions are high aboard Enterprise and within her task force. Fear of enemy submarines is pervasive. All eyes are open for them.
Someone spotted something they thought was a periscope, and of course the destroyer escorts opened fire on it. Dropped a few depth charges around. This thing kept bobbing up periodically, and they finally got up close enough to see what it was. Someone had lost a mop overboard somewhere during the line, and this thing was, the mop handle kept bouncing up toward the surface. And everyone was a little bit amazed about all of the depth charges and ammo was wasted on that mop.
But the deep waters near Hawaii do conceal legitimate threats. December 10th, 1941. The Big E is on patrol near the Hawaiian Islands. Off to the south of the carrier, Perry Teff, a dauntless dive bomber pilot from Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6, spots enemy submarines at the surface. Submarines have to come up for air at least once every 24 hours in order to run the diesel engines that recharge their batteries. This morning, Japanese submarine I-70 is in Perry Teff's sights. Time for some revenge. The American pilot swoops in and drops a 1,000-pound bomb. The explosion rocks the Japanese submarine, damaging it and preventing it from diving beneath the surface. Sometime later, fellow Enterprise scout pilot Clarence Dickinson, the man who parachuted from his damaged plane at Pearl Harbor, takes another dangerous dive on I-70. Dickinson plunges down towards the sub and finishes the job. Payback. It's the first enemy ship sunk by the U.S. Navy in World War II. And the kill belongs to USS Enterprise.
For the USS Enterprise to get the first naval kill, had to lift the spirits not only of just the ship's crew itself, but all of the American people. To show, you know what, we're not done. We're not even close to being done.
Enterprise carries on with its patrol duties in the waters near Hawaii until late January 1942. Try as it might, the ship has no luck locating enemy planes and surface vessels near its home islands. The Japanese fleet has long since retired to distant waters. February 1st, 1942. The days of training and patrolling are over. Time to take the fight to the enemy. Target, Wochi Island, Central Pacific, in the Marshall Islands chain. 100 miles west of Wochi, surveillance has revealed a heavy concentration of enemy vessels at Kwajalein Atoll. So while Northampton takes care of Wochi, Enterprise sends its SBD bombers to strike the Kwajalein anchorage. Dusty Cleese speeds south toward an outpost on tiny Kwajalein Island.
I found a cruiser there. So no fighters around. Oh boy, this is great. So I got up there and I made this dive.
If you wanted to be sure of hitting your target in World War II, you had to get in close.
There's a lot of factors that come into dive bombing. Speed, dive angle, altitude at release, winds aloft. Clearly, the longer you wait to release the bomb, the closer into the target you're going to be, and the less all those factors can influence the bomb's trajectory. So in that respect, waiting is better. But you also got to be able to pull out of that dive bomb. And you also want to release the munition so that when it explodes, you're not caught in the frag pattern. So back then, typically released a bomb between 1,000 and 2,000 feet. Again, the longer you wait, the more accurate it's going to be, but also the faster you're going to be pulling out and the lower you're going to be pulling out. So it's kind of there's a happy medium in there somewhere.
As he dives down toward the Japanese cruiser, Cleese has just one bomb aboard, a 500-pounder.
He knew he had one shot only. Everything had to be perfect. And he did it.
I clobbered it.
As he pulls out of his dive, Cleese is feeling pressure 5 to 6 times the force of gravity. But there's no better feeling than getting right up in the enemy's face and delivering a knockout blow. 5 miles to the north, a fellow Enterprise dive bomber pilot has discovered a cluster of merchant ships near the Carlos Pass. He scores a well-timed hit on a tanker scrambling toward the channel's mouth.
It was trying to go out at sea, and he hit it right on the head and caught it on fire.
The tanker just happens to be at the choke point of the channel, and it blocks passage by the remaining ships.
Well, here were all these ships inside of the lagoon.
Then the USS Enterprise launched 9 torpedo planes after it to go get those remaining ships that were caught inside of the channel.
Practically no anti-aircraft gun, and here these things couldn't move. Well, it was like shooting fish in the barrel.
The torpedo bombers sent by Enterprise are Douglas TBD Devastators, slow, antiquated aircraft that will soon be replaced by more agile planes. With a sluggish maximum speed of 207 miles per hour and a feeble rate of climb of just 720 feet per minute, TBDs are overly vulnerable to both enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. They carry a single 2,200-pound Mark 13 torpedo. The Enterprise TBDs pass over Kwajalein Lagoon and drop their payloads, but there's not a single explosion. At this point in the war, American torpedo technology is hit or miss, and it's mostly miss. 9 out of every 10 torpedoes veers off course or fails to detonate. It's a frustrating reality for the pilots risking their lives at Kwajalein.
launched their torpedoes. Not one hit.
Luckily, there are American bombers in the area too, and their explosives are working just fine. Kwajalein Harbor is a smoking, burning wreck by the time Admiral Halsey calls off the attack. Some 90 enemy personnel are killed at Kwajalein, including the area commander. The Marshall Islands raids are a huge success, and Enterprise returns to a hero's welcome at Pearl Harbor.
We were standing out there and cheering. I remember nurses waving towels. I remember some of the Army people holding their rifles up. And I even remember one guy holding a mop, and he was shaking that back and forth. They were so elated that somebody had whacked the enemy good and proper. And of course our sailors were manning the flight deck by the hundreds. And they were looking pretty spiffy up there. And as we passed the Nevada, those guys hollered out in unison, "Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray!" And our people responded, just unbelievably exhilarating. Hip, hip, hooray! Hip, hip, hooray! And it sounds kind of sophomoric at a time like this when you look back on it, but at that time it's just exactly what we needed.
The sailors and airmen of Enterprise will soon get yet another small taste of sweet revenge. Mid-April 1942. Sailors on the deck of USS Enterprise notice that the air is getting chillier. They've been operating in the steamy South Seas for weeks, and now the brisk weather is making it very obvious that they're sailing north. But only the Admiral seems to know why. At roughly 6 a.m. on the morning of April 12th, the men of the Big E and her task force notice a completely unexpected sight in the distance.
I walked out from the comm shack on the walkway, and I looked over there, and I couldn't believe my eyes.
The surprise vessel is friendly. It's their sister carrier, USS Hornet, but she's carrying mysterious cargo.
There was something wrong with Hornet's silhouette. What was wrong with it is the flight deck was half covered with these big, strange-looking airplanes that were not painted Navy colors, and they weren't naval aircraft. And they finally figured out they were B-25s, and they had Army camouflage painted on them.
The Army B-25s are here to make a bombing run on the heart of Japan. Target: Tokyo and other industrial centers around Japan. Objective: take out factories and munitions plants and demoralize the enemy by assaulting our homeland. Strategy: attack with 16 B-25 bombers launched from USS Hornet.
I don't like to use the word revenge, but sure. I mean, there was some revenge that they wanted to get some back. You know, they were mad. And they weren't stand for it then, and we don't stand for it now. You know, you reach out and you hurt us, we're coming after you. And you know what? There ain't a damn thing you can do about it.
Army Air Corps Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle has agreed to lead the daring mission. And he's chosen the B-25 as the aircraft on which to trust his life. The North American Mitchell B-25B is a twin-engine medium bomber with a range, depending on bomb load, of about 1,300 miles. It's typically manned by a crew of 5 and can deliver up to 5,000 pounds of bombs. While other bombers have more range and power, the B-25's modest wingspan of 67 feet 7 inches will allow USS Hornet to fit more bombers on its flight deck. The plan is for the carrier to get Doolittle's bombers within striking distance of Japan. They will then launch, bomb Tokyo and their other targets, and continue on to land in friendly remote Chinese territory. Since Hornet's normal defensive aircraft must be stored below deck to make room for the Mitchells, Enterprise and her task force will go along to protect the Hornet if she is attacked.
We were all thrilled, but we were scared to death. We said, this is a suicide mission.
In order to ensure that Doolittle's bombers have enough fuel to reach the designated landing area in China, Hornet and Enterprise need to get the planes within 400 miles of the Japanese mainland. But bad luck intervenes.
We ran across this little, what we thought was a fishing boat. Turned out to be a patrol boat. We didn't pick it up on our surface radar, it was that small. Cruiser Nashville went out with her 6-inch battery and sank this thing. And we thought, well, maybe we got away with it. But Radio Pearl Harbor actually intercepted a message reporting warships.
So they had to launch, and they had to launch right then and there. There was no turning back.
The carriers are 650 miles from the Japanese mainland. It means Doolittle and his men might not have the fuel to make it out safely. They choose to go anyway. At 8:20 a.m., on the cold, damp, and blustery morning of April 18th, 1942, the B-25 Mitchell bombers prepare for takeoff.
High wind, high seas, carrier racing 30 knots, pitching and bucking like a Bronco, about 25 knots headwind. Wind on the flight deck of the carrier is 55 knots.
The pilots have more to worry about than the weather. Carriers like Enterprise and Hornet weren't designed to launch planes this heavy. And this is the first time a B-25 has attempted to take off from a carrier in combat.
Now, that aircraft wasn't designed to be taken off in an aircraft carrier, so they really had to get as much wind over the deck as possible because wind over the deck translates to flying speed off the angle.
Once the bombers are speeding down the flight deck, there's only two places they can end up. With enough speed, they'll be in the sky. Too slow, and they'll be in the sea.
Taking off in a high wind, high sea environment is always tricky. Your number one priority right there is going to be making sure that the aircraft is lifting off the end of the deck when the bow is high.
Making it even more difficult, the bombers have been stripped of all non-essential items to make room for more fuel and bombs. They're even heavier than usual. Colonel Doolittle himself is the first to go.
And you got all these aircraft stacked up on the flight deck, so the first guys to take off have the least amount of runway.
Doolittle's bomber struggles off the deck, but manages to stay airborne.
And the second one to go off almost dipped into the water. And if I recall, there was one more plane that almost went in the drink. But all 16 of them got on their way.
Four hours after launch, the bombers finally reach their targets. Despite enemy flak, each plane drops 2,000 pounds of hell into the heart of the Japanese homeland. They then turn toward the Chinese coast and their designated landing area. But as the last drops of fuel funnel from the bombers' tanks, most of Doolittle's air crews have no choice but to bail out or crash land. Three crewmen perish in the process. 8 are captured by the Japanese. The physical damage done to Japan has been negligible, but but the psychological impact is truly significant on both sides of the Pacific.
It was definitely a morale booster, not only for our servicemen, but for our whole country. At a time of war, when the enemy is getting nailed at the heart of their homeland, it makes you feel like, you know what? You tried to stop us, ain't happening. We're coming after you. It showed the Japanese that they weren't invincible, that we could reach out and we could touch them.